Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by the professional contractors of NECA and union craftspeople of IBEW Local 48, providing vision for the future.
And by Kinko's, the Copy Center, offering a wide range of business services 24 hours a day.
Good evening. I'm Roger Mudd in Washington.
And I'm Jim Lehrer in New York. After our summary of the news this Tuesday, we get two answers to the question, who is Louis Freeh, the man chosen to head the FBI? Charlene Hunter-Gault profiles Supreme Court nominee Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and we close with excerpts from the Senate hearings on the gays in the military compromise.
Major funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by Pepsi. PepsiCo. And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life. Yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg promised today to be impartial and to get it right if confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. She made the comments at the opening of Senate Judiciary Committee hearings on her nomination. Ginsburg told the senators her approach on the bench would be neither liberal nor conservative, but one based on informed and independent judgment. If confirmed, as expected, Ginsburg would be the second woman on the court and the first justice nominated by a Democrat since the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. We'll have excerpts from the hearing and a profile of Judge Ginsburg later in the program. Roger?
President Clinton today nominated federal Judge Louis Freeh to run the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His selection came 24 hours after the president fired William Sessions as director. Judge Freeh, who is 43, a native of Jersey City and a graduate of Rutgers College and Rutgers Law School, was appointed by President Bush in 1991 to the U.S. District Court in New York. He had been an FBI agent for 6 years, a federal prosecutor for 10. President Clinton said Freeh dazzled observers when he won convictions against mafia leaders for smuggling heroin in the so-called Pizza Connection case. Mr. Clinton made his announcement in the White House Rose Garden.
Today, I am pleased to nominate a law enforcement legend to be the director of the FBI, Judge Louis Freeh. Judge Freeh knows the FBI. He is a highly decorated former agent and supervisor. He has investigated and prosecuted some of the most notorious and complex crimes of our time. He is experienced, energetic, and independent. He will be both good and tough, good for the FBI and tough on criminals.
We'll have more on the Freeh nomination after the news summary. House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Dan Rostenkowski refused to answer reporters' questions today about his alleged involvement in the House Post Office scandal. He was at the White House to discuss House-Senate budget negotiations with the president. Yesterday, the former postmaster of the House, Robert Rota, pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy and embezzlement. Rota admitted in court documents that he gave two unidentified congressmen about $30,000 in post office funds for their personal use. According to prosecutors, defense lawyers, and public records, the two congressmen are Rostenkowski, who has denied any wrongdoing, and former Representative Jim Coulter of Pennsylvania, who has made no comment.
The Senate Armed Services Committee began a review of President Clinton's policy on homosexuals in the military today. Defense Secretary Les Aspin and Joint Chiefs Chairman Colin Powell defended the Don't Ask, Don't Tell guidelines President Clinton outlined yesterday. Powell had this to say about the new policy.
I realize fully that this compromise will not satisfy all parties, but I believe that it is a good compromise that will be understood and supported by most Americans. It is also a compromise that will eliminate the tension that exists in the armed forces over this very, very complex and divisive issue. I also know that this is not the end of the matter. The debate will continue. I also don't pretend to know where the nation will be on this issue years in the future. But in my judgment, for now and for the set of circumstances we find ourselves in now, I believe that this is the right answer.
The committee chairman, Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, also announced his support of the new policy, saying he hoped Congress would now write it into law. We will have extended excerpts from today's hearing later in the program.
Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan today called the outlook for inflation disappointing. He warned the House Banking Committee that the Federal Reserve would raise interest at the first sign of any quickening in the rate, but raising rates could slow down an already slow economy. Greenspan also warned that interest rates could also be driven up by the financial markets if the president's $500 billion deficit reduction package is not enacted. In other economic news, the government reported today housing starts were unchanged last month. The report said construction of new homes and apartments was held back in part by flooding in the Midwest.
The Mississippi River swelled toward a new crest in St. Louis today as water levels dropped north of the city. Traffic was flowing again today across a bridge between Keokuk, Iowa and Hamilton, Illinois, the only passable bridge across the Mississippi for 200 miles. Emergency crews were able to reopen an access road to it last night. The river still is not crested in several towns south of St. Louis. Flooding is not expected to be a problem below Missouri, where the river becomes wider and deeper. Heavy rain fell in other parts of the Midwest. It forced the evacuation of 5,000 people in Manhattan, Kansas today. And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to Who is Louis Freeh, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the gays in the military hearings. Louis Freeh is our lead story tonight. He's the man President Clinton wants as director of the FBI. There's an opening there because Mr. Clinton fired William Sessions from that job just yesterday. Louis Freeh is a 43-year-old U.S. District Judge in New York City. He was an FBI agent for 6 years and then a federal prosecutor before going on the bench 2 years ago. Freeh was at the White House this morning with President Clinton for the nomination announcement.
I was born in Jersey City. And from about the age of my eldest son, I wanted to be an FBI agent. It was my first job after law school at age 25. The FBI is the greatest organization for law enforcement ever created by a democratic society. The brave men and women who serve in its ranks exemplify all of our country's police professionals dedicated to ensuring both safety and liberty. If confirmed by the Senate, I pledge my total commitment to a Federal Bureau of Investigation whose only beacon is the rule of law, whose sole task is protecting all of our people from crime and violence. Safety is particularly important for our children and young people, who all too often are now trapped in virtual war zones controlled by vicious criminals. The issue is stark. Do we allow criminals to destroy our Constitution and our freedoms? Or do we, as a people committed to the rule of law, take effective steps to preserve our most basic civil rights, to be protected against harm, to be free from fear, and to enjoy the full measure of liberty and opportunity in this great nation? Anyone doubting the need for an efficient FBI need only read the front page or watch the evening news. What most Americans once thought impossible has now occurred here. A terrorist bomb that killed, maimed, and spread terror in our nation's largest city. The FBI must not only catch those who have committed crimes, it must be an important step ahead of criminals, as often as possible, to prevent crime from being committed. It also has the unique ability in a democratic society to exculpate the innocent. In our country's rich traditions, we must make certain that the best of the past is surely the prologue of the challenges we face today and in the future. Before going on the Supreme Court, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone set into motion in the 1920s reforms that eventually led to the outstanding FBI of today. An FBI which has been strengthened by Judge Sessions' efforts to diversify its excellent workforce. These important efforts should be continued and strengthened. At its bedrock, the FBI must stand for absolute integrity, be free of all political influence, be free of any racial or other bias, and work solely in the public interest.
Tell us more about Louis Freeh is what we are going to say now to Don Baer, Assistant Managing Editor of U.S. News and World Report, who covered Freeh's work at the Justice Department and the FBI, and to Frank Story, a former Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's New York City office. He was in charge of the FBI's Organized Crime Unit, in which Freeh worked as a prosecutor. Don Baer, how would you describe Louis Freeh?
Well, I think one of the things you have to know about him is that he brings nearly unique circumstances to this job and experience. You know, he's been an FBI agent, a federal prosecutor, and a federal judge, and that's almost unheard of in the whole federal prosecution and federal system. The importance of all those things is that he understands the inner workings of the FBI. He knows, from having been a prosecutor, how cases are put together in a meticulous fashion, in particular big, long-term cases like the Pizza Connection case in New York. And as a federal judge, he brings the strong suit, the one strong suit that his two predecessors brought to the job, which is William Webster and William Sessions, a sense of rectitude and probity that we expect to find in a federal judge.
Frank Story, how would you describe him?
Extremely dedicated, innovative individual who led the fight against organized crime in the early 80s. A hard-working person, a good person. A man
Tough guy? Is he a tough guy?
He's a man of integrity. I wouldn't describe Judge Free as a tough man, but he certainly made a lot of tough decisions during the organized crime investigations in the 1980s, in particular the Pizza Connection case, which was an investigation that lasted 4 years. The prosecutorial input that he provided was outstanding.
You worked on that case, too, with him.
I worked on that case. I was in charge of the organized crime program at that particular time.
So when President Clinton described him today as a law enforcement legend, which sounds kind of strange, a guy only being 43 years old, is that what the reference, that's what it's referring to, is the Pizza Connection case?
I would say the Pizza Connection case, the other organized crime investigations, a lot of these investigations were very innovative, long-term in nature. The efforts that we made at that time were unprecedented, and he had a big part in that.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, Don Baer, that was the case? Well, you mentioned it that was the case that has given him this moniker, law enforcement legend?
Yeah, basically that's right, Jim. Although I would say this about Louis Free. When you meet him, and I met him several years ago in covering some of the later Pizza Connection cases, you're struck immediately by how unusual he is in the context of some federal law enforcement circles. I remember meeting him, and he doesn't strike you as the kind of fellow who is a top-flight federal law prosecutor, especially in the district that he worked in, which is the Southern District of New York. Frank Story can tell you that's the creme de la creme of the federal prosecution force. Quite often you run into people there with Ivy League backgrounds who come from big, fancy Park Avenue law firms before they go back into government service. Louis Free was nothing like that, and it was amazing that despite the fact that he didn't have that kind of paper credential and didn't stand out in that way, that he was generally regarded as one of the best prosecutors in the office.
Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I would add he was an agent's agent, an agent's prosecutor. He was well respected within the FBI. While he was an agent, while he was a federal prosecutor, he was well respected. He's a true human being in the sense that he's a good family man. He's well-rounded. He has good common sense approach to solve difficult problems. He's an outstanding choice. The president could have made a better choice than he made today.
Will the FBI agents consider him an insider or an outsider coming in?
I would think they would consider him a little bit of both. He was with the FBI for 6 years. He's very close to the Bureau during his tenure as a federal prosecutor. But he's done an awful lot outside the FBI as well as in the FBI. So you have a very unique person here. He brings an awful lot to the table. And I just don't think you could find a better man to lead the Bureau where it should go in the future.
Don Baer, does it concern some people that he does come from the FBI and he does come from federal law enforcement, that he may not bring an outside perspective, or is that even what is needed right now?
Well, let me say this. He came of age in the FBI at a time, as Frank can tell you, that was very difficult for the FBI when it was going through the transformation after the Hoover years, and that's when he grew up in the FBI. So he understands the difficulties and the need for the FBI to continue to transform itself. So I think from that standpoint, he'll be good. One of the real problems that William Sessions ran into, as you know, is that he was an outsider, and he never got along well with the bureaucracy inside the FBI, and in the end, some people argue that was his undoing. Louis Free should not have the same kind of problems. And yet, as I say, having been a federal judge, having been a fellow who has always done it his way, done it down the line, but done it his way, he ought to be able to be independent. I would say also it's interesting that he should look independent from the president and from the Justice Department as well. This is not somebody who's a part of the inner circle of the Clinton campaign. In fact, there's no evidence to suggest he even voted for President Clinton last fall. And to that extent, I think it probably will work well with him, both with the FBI and with the public.
You agree that he'll be an independent person, Frank Story?
Yes, I do. I think he will be independent. In fact, when he was a federal prosecutor and we were on the investigative side in the Pizza Connection case, and and other organized crime investigations. He maintained that independence. He was very objective in his thoughts and his counsel to us as investigators. We worked very well together as a team. But when he made a decision from a prosecutorial sense, that was the decision. He wasn't influenced by what we had to say.
You've mentioned many great things about the guy. What is the best thing about him? What does he do best as a law enforcement or prosecutor?
Well, he's very organized. He's very innovative. A lot of the approaches that he initiated during the commission case, during the Peace Connection case, were very innovative from a prosecutive sense. But then also as an investigator, he worked the major labor racketeering case in the late 1970s entitled UNIRAC. It was the first multi-divisional approach to labor racketeering in the country. So he's done it as an investigator, as a prosecutor, and also as a federal judge.
What are his weaknesses?
To be honest with you, he doesn't have any. The only I used to marvel.
Unlike every other human being?
Well, I used to marvel at the long hours he would work. And, of course, in the early years, he wasn't married. He married a little later in life. He now has 4 children, so he's going to have to find time to spend with them. But to be honest with you, he doesn't have any weaknesses that I'm aware of.
Don Bear, the FBI, you talked about the transformation process that's still underway. What is your reading of what that transformation should continue to head for? In other words, what still needs to be done to make the FBI attuned to what's going on in this country and what the needs are, the Justice Department and law enforcement generally?
Well, there's no question that we've got a law enforcement or a crime crisis in the country still. The extent to which that the FBI director can move forward and get the FBI and federal law enforcement more fully involved in street consideration, street crime, problems that are ongoing, move some of the big cases like Peace Connection and the racketeering cases into other areas. And of course, in some of the more traditional areas, such as drug enforcement and whatnot, there's real need to improve on the going after Asian crime syndicates and whatnot, where in the past they've been looking more at Italian crime syndicates. So those are the kinds of things they need to do. Now, Louis Freeh may also run into some tensions with Justice in the White House over some of the things that we've heard those two institutions want the FBI to move into, and that the FBI bureaucracy itself is somewhat resistant about.
Like what?
There's been talk about having the FBI track down deadbeat dads as part of welfare reform. There's been talk about having the FBI to monitor anti-abortion protesting more. These are things that are not part of the traditional function of the FBI, and that I suspect Louis Freeh, as someone who appreciates the limits as well as the reach of the FBI, will be somewhat concerned about.
Would you agree with that?
I would agree in part with what Don's saying. I think the Bureau has to be focused on major criminal activity, as they have in the past. They can't be diverted to areas that they have no business being in. There's a need to look at...
But isn't that somebody else's decision to make rather than the FBI's?
Well, the FBI has to be able to provide objective input into those decisions. The decisions are reached collectively with the Department of Justice and other organizations in Washington. But the FBI cannot turn its back on what it's done in the past. There's a need to look at the reallocation of resources related to foreign counterintelligence. Where are we going to go in the 90s with the events that have taken place in Europe and so forth? And that's important. There's a need for strong leadership. He will apply that to the FBI. He will have the confidence of the Bureau behind him, and I think will take the FBI where it should go in the 90s.
This whole Sessions agony that went on for 6 months, there's been much written and much spoken about, not only in the last 24 hours, but even before that, about the damage this has done internally, whichever position you might take on it, but the damage that has been done as a result of this within the FBI. How would you assess that, and what do you think Louis Freeh must do quickly to correct it?
He must assume a strong leadership position. He has to lead. He has an extremely good record to do that. There's a lot of fine executives in the FBI that are looking for that leadership. The FBI is a very resilient, very strong organization. They've gone through troubled times in the past and have always righted themselves, and I think they will this time. There is some morale problems naturally when something like this occurs, but the FBI is a very dedicated law enforcement organization that is really geared towards fighting major criminal activities, and that's what they'll be doing in the future.
Don Bear, what kind of difficulty does Louis Freeh inherit?
Well, I think much of the morale problem has been overstated with regard to Sessions. It's been a big problem up at the top. I don't think the drift has taken place for that long, and the FBI has continued to move along on some of its more important cases. However, I do think what he has to do now he may have to employ certain kinds of techniques that aren't his strongest suits. Mainly, he's got to be a very good manager and executive at this point, and that's probably where he has the least experience. He has run big prosecution forces of a couple of hundred agents and several lawyers and whatnot. But as a federal judge, and this has been the problem that both Sessions and Webster both ran into, you don't run much of anything. You run your chambers, and that's about it. So he's going to have to come in and be a strong executive and manager, lay down some very specific and precise goals and get moving on that. And it'll be interesting to see how quickly he's able to move.
Yeah, and that is his number one task, is it not? It's to manage, what is there, 22,000 people who work for the FBI.
Right.
That's his number one job, is it not?
That is his number one job, and as I say, that's probably his weakest suit. It is an enormous bureaucracy, and it's a big task, and as we've said, it's a bureaucracy that's undergoing a big transformation right now. Not just because of Sessions leaving and a new director coming in, but because of minorities and women who have been brought in during the Webster and Sessions period, new kinds of cases that they may be asked to undertake. So it will be a very big task.
All right. Don Baer, Frank Story, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Still ahead on the NewsHour, Supreme Court nominee Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the Joint Chiefs testify about gays in the military. We turn now to another presidential nominee, Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the president's choice to replace Justice Byron White on the Supreme Court. Ginsburg's televised confirmation hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee began today, and we'll have excerpts from it in a few minutes. But first, Charlene Hunter-Gault has prepared this profile of the judge through the eyes of close friends and colleagues.
I am proud to nominate this path-breaking attorney, advocate, and judge to be the 107th Justice to the United States Supreme Court.
This is Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
She's a very good lawyer. She is very bright. She is very well informed about the law. My experience is that if she's on your side, it's great to have her on the panel. She's very effective as a exponent of a particular point of view.
And this is Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
You can't be around Ruth and her husband and then watch her with her kids, especially her grandchildren, and not know that a large part of their focus is on their family and what the family is doing.
I've come to the conclusion that in some ways she really is two people at war with one another.
A liberal and a conservative?
A private person and a judge.
Whether Ruth Bader Ginsburg really is two people at war with one another might be open to argument. But most observers agree that the diminutive Ruth Bader Ginsburg is hard to categorize and therefore hard to predict. Non-ideological is how many describe her, including Georgetown law professor and longtime friend Patricia King.
I think that's fair because as long as I've known Ruth, I never think of her as a person of strong political views.
King, who wrote a letter to President Clinton supporting Judge Ginsburg's nomination, describes herself as being on the far left politically.
I really supported Ruth's nomination to the court, not because I'm sure that she's going to rule the way I would rule if I were on the court, or that I'm going to always love what she has to say. I did it because I knew her, I had a sense of her. I know we share the same values. Fairness, a concern and a caring that members of the society be treated fairly, an emphasis on family and its importance, loyalty, friendship, the old-fashioned virtues.
Among the values that endeared Judge Ginsburg and her husband Marty to King and her activist husband Roger Wilkins was the Ginsburg's resignation from a golf club that discriminated against blacks.
She didn't kid herself by saying, gee, it's all right for me to continue playing in this club while my friends can't play. Her view is, you resign. That was the way she was about trying to get some of the clubs in the city to admit women. Her view was always that club doesn't admit a woman, then you're not supposed to join.
Despite this, critics like Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz have complained that Judge Ginsburg doesn't have the credentials or the passionate commitment on race and social justice held by the late Justice Thurgood Marshall, who, like Judge Ginsburg, used the 14th Amendment as a tool to fight discrimination before joining the court. But supporters take issue with that criticism. Kathleen Paradas is a private attorney who worked with Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the American Civil Liberties Union in the 70s.
Well, in a lot of ways, she'll never be Thurgood Marshall. The personalities couldn't be more different. But she has already achieved for women's constitutional law what Thurgood Marshall achieved for race discrimination law. She's already done that. She did that in the 70s.
At the time, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was working as the head of a new women's rights project created by the American Civil Liberties Union in 1969. She'd been recruited from Rutgers University Law School, where she was earning a reputation as a major strategist on women's rights issues. David Cole, an expert on constitutional law at Georgetown University Law School, says Ginsburg's strategy was both groundbreaking and effective.
She is someone who successfully used constitutional law to expand the protections afforded to a discriminated against group in our society, women. She did that very effectively by using male plaintiffs, by picking cases that were not sort of the kind of hot-button, very controversial, high-profile cases, but rather bringing sort of technical cases about Social Security provisions, about pension benefits, etc., so that the court, in making these moves, in recognizing that gender discrimination violates the Equal Protection Clause, would not be doing it in the sort of the most heated fulcrum.
One case was Kahn versus Shevin. It involved a Florida property tax exemption that was automatically given to widows on the presumption that they were dependent on their deceased spouses. No such presumption was made in the case of widowers. The case was pursued on behalf of the widower, but it was designed to ensure that both men and women benefited. As the National Law Journal reported, Ginsburg was uncommonly successful, arguing 6 high court cases and winning all but one.
She was viewed as Joan of Arc. She had won a case in 1971 that was the first time the Supreme Court had ever found a gender classification unconstitutional. And I recall rejoicing with my feminist friends in California at that time. It was a watershed. It was an incredible, unbelievable turning point, and we knew that she had done it. So I knew who she was and what her work was long before I ever laid eyes on her.
Many might see Ginsburg's work as the logical extension of her personal life experience. After all, she herself had been the victim of gender discrimination, even as she was preparing for the profession that would enable her to fight it. It had been difficult for a woman to get into Cornell, where Ruth Bader earned an undergraduate degree in government, and her next stop, Harvard Law School, was hardly better. In Ruth Bader Ginsburg's class, there were 550 men and 8 women. Aaron Griswold, then dean of the law school, remembers how hard it was to get women admitted.
In the faculty, there was some opposition. And with the help of Professor Mark Howe, we cajoled some of our faculty colleagues. And I think that I used the contention that, it isn't all that important. There aren't going to be a great many of them. There were some faculty members who did not wholeheartedly join in it. One of our fine and younger faculty members of early middle age wouldn't call on women in class except one day each month, which he called Ladies' Day.
At Harvard, Ruth Bader Ginsburg stood out, not only because of her gender, but because she was married and had a baby daughter. Despite all that, it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg that made Law Review and not husband Marty, as he proudly predicted. When he joined a prominent law firm in New York, his wife followed, entering Columbia Law School and graduating as one of 2 firsts in her class. Despite that, no law firm would hire her. She was smart, but she was also a woman, a Jew, and a mother, all no-nos in the 1950s. Unable to get a job at a law firm as a lawyer, Ruth Bader Ginsburg joined the few women teaching law, first at Rutgers, then at Columbia. By this time, her ACLU work had plunged her into a new world, the world of legal advocacy for women. Jerry Lynch was a student and later a colleague of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's at Columbia University Law School in New York.
To me, Ruth as a teacher was very specifically inspirational because unlike most of the rest of the faculty, she was someone who was involved in the real world as an advocate, who was involved in social reform. That showed how one could combine an academic career with activity in the world.
In 1980, President Carter appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the federal bench in the District of Columbia. One of her colleagues was Judge Robert Bork, the Reagan nominee to the Supreme Court, whose conservative writings gave liberals the ammunition to sink his nomination.
I think she will be very strong for women's rights, for pro-abortion, maybe for homosexual rights, affirmative action, and so forth.
And yet, when President Clinton nominated Ruth Bader Ginsburg to serve on the Supreme Court, for all her past advocacy, some women's rights groups expressed concern.
Concerns about whether she views the right to choose as a fundamental right or some lesser right that would leave women exposed to the intervention of state legislatures.
The source of their concern was the Madison Lecture, a 1993 speech Ruth Bader Ginsburg made at New York University Law School. In it, she expressed reservations about the reasoning in the landmark Roe v. Wade case that affirmed a woman's right to an abortion. She said Roe v. Wade halted a political process that was moving in a reform direction and thereby, I believe, prolonged divisiveness and deferred stable settlement of the issue.
Well, I think that most women know, as I said, who she is, where she came from, that she's absolutely committed to choice, that she was suggesting perhaps a different way to have gotten to this point might have been a better way, might have been more secure.
I think precisely what she was arguing was that Roe may have been a case that stirred more controversy than it settled, that the reasoning may not have been intellectually sound, that the sweep of the decision may have been politically damaging, and that a somewhat more conservative decision might have in the long run been more effective, as well as being better grounded intellectually.
But while women's groups seem to have retreated now, there is still some concern about whether Ruth Bader Ginsburg's judicial robes lay more heavily than her commitment to social justice. While sitting on the district court in Washington, D.C., Judge Ginsburg in fact often voted with her conservative colleagues, 85% of the time, according to a study by the Legal Times in 1988, in some civil rights as well as criminal and gay rights cases. Bruce Shapiro of the Nation Institute, a liberal Supreme Court watch group.
She was asked to write an opinion concerning a nearly 20-year-old desegregation case in which an organization called the Women's Equity Action League had brought suit to force a reluctant federal government to enforce desegregation laws in higher education in 17 or 18 states. In that case, she said that the courts have no business enforcing civil rights laws in an expansive way, that that's really the job of the executive branch of government, and she threw the case out of the court. Too often, when there's a conflict between her private social conscience and her sort of conservative institutional philosophy, it gets decided on the side of institutional restraint rather than on the side of civil rights.
In the final analysis, then, what kind of Supreme Court justice do close observers think Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be?
I think she'll be liberal in the big social issues. That is, she wrote that she did not think that classifying people by race was wrong, even where there had been no past discrimination, which I take it to be a position in favor of affirmative action, maybe quotas. No, I think she has an ideological core, and I think it's liberal.
Those sympathies, that kind of career working for the underdog rather than the overdog is something that no member of the current court has, and is very important to be represented on the court. That kind, not just that political viewpoint, but that kind of that gut experience of working as a lawyer for change is something that since Thurgood Marshall has not been on the court.
The concern that I have, however, is this deep-seated institutional conservatism and the articulated views that she has about the limited role of the court. This is a really crucial time in which the Supreme Court has been steadily withdrawing from advancing civil rights, with defending civil rights. That might not matter if we saw Congress willing to take leadership. That might not matter if we saw the president willing to take leadership.
I think that she will probably be a more activist judge than a lot of people's speculations would indicate. I think that she is very committed to principle. She's very committed to civil liberties principle. And I think that when she is constrained in a different way by precedent, it's not that she won't be constrained by precedent on the Supreme Court, but she'll be constrained in a different way than she has been as a Court of Appeals judge. I think that she will be much more interested in assuring a proper outcome and in not being bound by what the Supreme Court has previously done.
At her confirmation hearing today, Judge Ginsburg tried to assure all 18 members of the Senate Judiciary Committee who had consumed 2 hours in welcoming her that she would not wear a specific ideological label on the court.
The controversies that come to the Supreme Court as the last judicial resort touch and concern the health and well-being of our nation and its people. They affect the preservation of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Serving on this court is the highest honor, the most awesome trust that can be placed in a judge. It means working at my craft, working with and for the law as a way to keep our society both ordered and free. Let me try to state in a nutshell how I view the work of judging. My approach, I believe, is neither liberal nor conservative. Rather, it is rooted in the place of the judiciary, of judges, in our democratic society. The Constitution's preamble speaks first of we the people, and then of their elected representatives. The judiciary is third in line, and it is placed apart from the political fray so that its members can judge fairly, impartially, in accordance with the law, and without fear about the animosity of any pressure group.
Judge, can you discuss with me for a moment what allows courts to recognize rights like the right to marry whomever you wish, like the right to be employed or not employed based upon, without there being a distinction between males and females? What is it that allows the court to recognize such rights that the drafters of the Constitution or specific amendments did not specifically mention or even contemplate at the time the amendment, in the case of the 14th Amendment, where the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were drafted?
That's a large question, Mr. Chairman, and I'll do my best to respond. First, I think the credit goes to the founders. When I visited Senator Thurman, he was kind enough to give me a pocket constitution, but this pocket constitution contains another document, and it is our basic rights declaring document. It is the Declaration of Independence. the Declaration that created the United States. I think the framers are shortchanged if we view them as having a limited view of rights, because they wrote, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government is formed to protect and secure those rights." Now, when the Constitution was written, as you know, there was much concern over a Bill of Rights. There were some who thought a Bill of Rights dangerous because one couldn't enumerate all the rights of the people. One couldn't compose a complete catalog. The thing to do was to limit the powers of government, and that would keep government from trampling on people's rights. You might contrast it with the great French Declaration of the Rights of Man, which does confer a right, the state confers a right to speak freely. But in our Bill of Rights, it doesn't say the state gives one a right to speak. It says Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion or abridging the freedom of speech. So the whole thrust of it is people have rights, and government must be kept from trampling on them, and the rights are stated with great breadth in the Declaration of Independence.
Let me just move on to something else. I would like to ask you whether you agree with the following statements about the role of the judge, including the Supreme Court justice. If a judge abandons the intention of the lawmakers as his or her guide, there is no law available to the judge, and the judge begins to legislate a social agenda for the American people. That goes well beyond his or her legitimate power.
The judge has a law, whether it's a statute that Congress passes or our highest law, the Constitution, to construe, to interpret, and must try to be faithful to the provision. But it's no secret that some of these provisions are not self-defining.
Right.
Some of the laws that you write are not self-defining. There's nothing a judge would like better than to be able to look at a text and say, this text is clear and certain. I do not have to go beyond it to comprehend its meaning. But often that is not the case. And so a judge must do more than read the specific words. The judge will read on to see what else is in the law and read back to see what was there earlier. The judge will look at precedent. How are the words in this provision or in a similar provision construed? So the effort is always to relate to the intent of the lawgiver, the lawmaker. But sometimes that intent is obscure.
Judge Ginsburg continues before the Senate Judiciary Committee tomorrow with another round of questioning from the members.
Next tonight, excerpts from the Senate Armed Services Committee's hearing on gays in the military. Yesterday, President Clinton announced a compromise labeled "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." The administration plan was defended today by Defense Secretary Aspen and the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Committee Chairman Sam Nunn, Democrat of Georgia, said he wanted Congress to help write the final policy.
In the military, the mission is the first priority. The unit is the second priority. The individual is the third priority. This is vastly different from our civilian society where the rights of the individual properly come first. I believe the Armed Services Committee should handle this issue through the normal legislative process. That's what we have strived to do. I hope that we can reach a majority consensus on legislative findings in this committee, which will lay the foundation for Senate floor debate and serve as a guide for the federal courts when these issues are adjudicated as they will be. I hope that we will receive testimony today and tomorrow that will enable us to mark up legislation that is consistent with the policy announced by the President and by Secretary Aspin.
Our perspective is a unique one, and it's the unique perspective of the military and what is best for military effectiveness. The military exists to fight the nation's wars, to accomplish our warfighting mission. Hopefully we are always strong enough to deter wars, but always ready to fight and win them if necessary. And to win wars, we create cohesive teams of warriors who will bond so tightly that they are prepared to go into battle and give their lives, if necessary, for the accomplishment of the mission and for the cohesion of the group and for their individual buddies. We cannot allow anything to happen which would disrupt that feeling of cohesion within the force. We are the best force in the world, and to be the best requires subjugating individual rights to the benefit of the group and the benefit of the team. Military service requires sacrifices in many, many forms. The proposed compromise that we have before the nation, the policy as announced by the President yesterday, permits gay and lesbian Americans to serve if they are willing to keep their orientation a private matter. It's a sacrifice we believe it is necessary for them to make for the overall good of the service and the cohesive teams that they are going to be a part of. We won't ask, we won't witch hunt, we will not seek to learn orientation. This is a significant change on the part of the military. I believe Secretary Aspin and the President displayed a great deal of courage in dealing with this issue head-on and forthrightly. I also believe that they have made a correct choice, a choice which is in the best interest of the armed forces and the best interest of the American people. And I ask for your support of the President's decision. Thank you.
What is the justification in the military service as opposed to civilian society for placing the rights of the unit and the mission before individual rights?
Because we live in a somewhat coercive society within the military. What we ask our people to do is to put their lives on the line, to march up hills in the face of machine guns. A level of cohesion is required that is not required anywhere else in our society. I don't know that I can express it much better than that, Senator. It's also a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, 365-day job. You don't go home at 5 o'clock. You may be living in the most incredible conditions all day long, 24 hours a day, with people that are part of your family, your most close relations, frankly. And in that set of circumstances, it is very difficult to introduce this element of gender differentiation, especially along homosexual lines.
With regard to the individual over unit rights, I think that this goes back to the very right of serving in the armed forces. There really is no right of serving in the armed forces. If there were, those whose right eye is weak or those who have other characteristics that enable them not to be able to serve effectively according to what experience has taught us over the years in the armed forces would have every right to seek service and to perhaps serve well. But they are a risk because of their the possibility that their particular characteristic, whatever it may be, can become a disintegrating factor in terms of unit cohesion. Generally speaking, as this body has heard from far many more voices and far younger voices than those at the table here today, there is not an acceptance of homosexuality among those who serve in the armed forces. And to try and inject that, to try and enforce or force it into the ranks simply would create a fracture that would, in my view, be contrary to the cohesiveness that we talked about.
General Powell, I'd like for
you and the other chiefs to answer this question. I want your personal opinion in response to one central question. Is the policy which the President announced yesterday what you agreed to? Did the White House or others make changes to the policy after you indicated your agreement? Do you agree with the policy as it was announced?
I do, both as a professional matter and as a private matter.
Joe Sullivan?
Policy, yes,
Do you
sir,
agree
I do.
with the policy as announced?
Yes, I do, and I support it.
I support the
policy, Senator.
I
support the policy, McPhee? Senator.
Yes, sir, I support
Admiral Kelso?
Yes, sir, I support
Admiral Jeremiah?
Yes, sir. Secretary Aspen, do we, by virtue of this policy, treat heterosexuals equally with homosexuals, or are heterosexuals or homosexuals set apart as a separate class and treated differently?
Well, I think what this policy does is it moves towards a policy that treats private conduct privately. I mean, it essentially is a policy that says that private conduct is private in terms of investigations, in terms of interest of the service.
Yes or no? Yes or no? Do we create a separate class of persons within the military by virtue of their sexual orientation? Yes or no?
We move away from that towards a policy which creates a policy that says that privacy is privacy. That's what it does. That's the best answer I can give you, Senator.
So, in your judgment, we're treating heterosexuals co-equal?
Not entirely. We're moving in that direction, but
we haven't gotten there yet.
No, sir.
Aspen also said he thought homosexuals would still be more comfortable in other non-military professions.
Again, the main stories of this Tuesday: Supreme Court Justice nominee Ginsburg promises to be impartial and to get it right if confirmed. And President Clinton picked federal judge and former prosecutor Louis Freeh to be the next director of the FBI. Finally tonight, an update on the flooding in St. Charles County, Missouri. Last night on the NewsHour, Elizabeth Brackett reported on a group of Missourians fighting to save their homes and their church from the rising flood waters. This was the scene yesterday when they were ordered to evacuate. They left behind a wall of sandbags which was already starting to leak. Elizabeth went back to the church today.
The little church on the hill still stood above the water today, but not by much. The frantic work of hundreds of volunteers on Sunday kept the church dry. This morning, Reverend Ken Spilger walked the sandbags and checked the water level.
When I called the Army, the Corps of Engineers, they had told me that the water level at 6 a.m. today was the same as yesterday, 46.8.
So even though it's crested, it's not going down.
Yeah, the crest was 46.9 Sunday night.
It was after that crest when sandbaggers were pulled off Sunday night. For the moment, said the pastor, they had beaten the river.
At this point, we feel very blessed. I mean, I don't want to sound, like Pollyanna in the sense, but I would think at this point we have, if we don't have another crest, it's done. We have a lot of cleanup to do. But as far as the flood is concerned, yes, unless there's another wave comes in.
There was not much left for Reverend Spilger to do, but thank the volunteers who dropped by.
We thank you. Appreciate it.
Give us a call over there if you need it.
We'll do that. Really will. Thank you.
All right.
The news for the homes they tried so hard to save is not good. The wall held, but once they pulled the pumps out, there's been so much seepage through the sandbags that the water is now the same level on both sides of the wall.
When the work stopped Sunday night, Tom and Betty Scott's house was still dry. They had worked night and day building the wall of sandbags to keep it that way. Today, the Scott's house looked very different. A discouraged Betty Scott looked at the scene.
What do you think now when you look out over the scene?
Well, I think that's 25 years of work right there. It's gone down the drain, and a lot of money. But we did it before, and we can do it again.
If we could have had the pumps big enough, and they wasn't available to us, if we had the pumps, we could still be in good shape right now. Because what it's doing right now is seeking its own level with the seepage coming in and the MSD sewage coming back up through the trunk line, just slowly coming up, and it's going to equal itself out. what can you do? You know, we did our best shot. Our best shot.
What do you think about the river now?
It's uncontrollable. It's got its own mind. It's going to do whatever it wants to do. You know, I think it proved to everybody that we can't hold it back.
On the other side of the church, Carol Kronsberg's battle was still going on. The church had sent volunteers over to help build her wall, and for the moment, her house was still dry.
It's just been incredible, the people that have come out here and helped. I'm sorry.
Did you know very many of these people who helped you build the wall?
Oh, there were a lot of friends, but there were people from everywhere. There were people who were on vacation who came home to help. And they've done this twice. They widened it. It's just amazing to watch them.
But both Kronsberg and Reverend Stilger were worried about today's noon report from the Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps predicted a second, higher crest on the river tonight. And that meant another night of watching and worrying for those in a battle that never seems to end.